Hi there, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts, and welcome to Karen's Quilt Circle. Have you ever thought about entering a quilt show? Well, I have too. So today I've invited to the circle Peter Byrne, winner of QuiltCon 2020. I know Peter personally, as we are both members of the Toronto Modern Quilt Guild, and I've watched him as he has evolved into the championship quilter he is today. We had a lot of fun in this interview as we discussed his journey to become a quilter, his path to QuiltCon, and he has some fabulous tips on how you can up your quilting game. So grab your sewing and a cup of tea, and here's my interview with Peter Byrne. Today, I'd like to welcome Peter Byrne. Peter has always been very generous with his time and his advice and support within the Guild. And though we've known each other for about 3 or 4 years, I would say that we got to know each other a lot better in the last year. This
Absolutely.
year, I consider you a friend instead of just a fellow quilter. And it was so exciting to see you win QuiltCon. It's like the gold medal of quilting, or the Academy Award. It was so exciting to see you get up that award, and not only once, but twice.
Well, thank you, Karen Brown, for having me join you today. It's awesome to be here with you today. Yeah, my experience at QuiltCon could not have been better. It was actually pretty life-changing in many ways as far as what I'm able to do with my quilting and the opportunities that have come my way since winning at QuiltCon. It's been really great.
So before we get into now, let's just go back to the beginning. How did you get into quilting? Are there quilters in your family?
I was a hairstylist for 30 years, and I retired in 2009. And I have an aunt that lives in Niagara Falls, and she's been a quilter for many, many years. And every summer when I would visit, she'd always bring out her newest quilts that she was working on. And I said to myself, one day when I have extra time, I'm going to get a little sewing machine and actually start making a quilt. So that happened in 2009. I started making quilts, not knowing at all what a quilt really was or how to go about making them, but I just really enjoyed the process. So over the years, I made quilts for all of my friends and family and really enjoyed that. And then to further my interest in quilting, at the beginning of 2017, I joined the Toronto Modern Quilt Guild. And when I joined the Toronto Modern Quilt Guild, I had never quilted a quilt. Like I said, I really didn't know all that much about quilting.
Had you done quilt tops till then?
I was making quilts, but they had absolutely no quilting stitches at all. They didn't have any batting because I didn't know what that word meant. I didn't know how to do binding, so I just kind of like turned the edges and sewed them in. So they were quilts, but they certainly weren't the 3 layers of quilting that we all know what a quilt is made up of now. So yeah, it was very different back then compared to what I'm making now. But in 2017, I decided to become a full-time student of this craft and just wanting to learn absolutely everything about it. So I ended up taking over 100 courses online, and I also joined the York Heritage Quilt Guild. So between my memberships at the 2 guilds, making new friends within the quilting community, I was able to take my journey from not knowing at all really what a quilt was to actually making award-winning quilts.
Well, right from the very beginning, your quilts were always quite spectacular. You had big ideas right from the very beginning. I think bolder than a lot of beginners. Do you think what did you bring to the table that made you that way? Was it you've always been creative, or you just embraced the color?
Absolutely, Karen. Like when I was a young child, I was not into sports at all. Everything for me was all about doing crafts. So when I was very young, I did leather work and really mastered that and taught that. And then when I was a young teen, I started doing macrame hangers and actually turned that into a part-time business where I was supplying 2 local shops with macrame hangers for sale. And so I went through different phases where I would do some drawing and I would do some painting with oil. So I was always using my hands within my work, but also within doing crafts as well. And part of the reason why when I started quilting in 2009, I didn't want to go online and learn anything. I didn't want to have any outside influences in my head on what my designs were and what my designs meant to me. So when I actually did join the Toronto Modern in 2017, I had made an awful lot of quilts for all of my friends and family. So I had that experience of doing crafts in my background, and I certainly brought that forward with me when I started making quilts.
Now, I know that your road to QuiltCon was quite intentional. There was some moment that you made a decision that you were going to switch from making quilts to making show quilts. I remember you talking about walking around shows with Stephanie. And what pivots did you have to make in your quilting plans and your designs when you made those discoveries?
Yeah, so as I was learning through 2017 and 2018, I did go to Quilt Canada both those years. And the first year was very inspiring to see quilts in a show, but it was really in 2018 when I went to that show, I was kind of looking at things through a different lens. And that was, what is the quality of stitching, the quality of piecing, the overall quality of these quilts in a show? How does that look? And do I have the skills to be able to do that? And so I had a really close look in 2018. And I was open to new adventures when I joined the Toronto Modern. So I did have some goals in mind. And one was to eventually teach people how to quilt. And the other one was to make show quilts and go in that direction. So there were a lot of things to learn. Absolutely. I had no idea what all of that meant, but I found the thought of it to be very exciting and very inviting. In November of 2017, the York Heritage Quilt Guild put on their quilt show. And this is an event they do every 3 years. And so I had put 2 quilts in that show, and there were actually Viewers' Choice Awards that were going to be given out. So a few days after the show, I received an email saying that I was winning a Viewers' Choice Award. And I was really, really blown away because the 2 quilts that I put in the show were like my 4th quilt that I had quilted and my 5th quilt that I had quilted. So when I got that recognition for Viewers' Choice, it really did propel my thoughts on, yes, I'd really like to go forward and have this experience again with putting quilts into juried shows.
Did you make intentions with your designs thinking, well, I would like to do this, but maybe this would be more show worthy? Did you ever have to make those type of decisions?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that you have to give thought to if you're going to make quilts for a show. Depending on what show that you're going to be going into, there's a list of like guidelines, rules and regulations that you have to become familiar with so you don't accidentally do something and then you wouldn't be able to put your quilt into that show. Just as a quick example, there might be a size restriction on what your quilt could be. So if you're measuring the perimeter and you're 3 inches over, all of a sudden that quilt can't go in the show unless you're willing to cut all that binding off and resize it. So there's definitely homework that you have to do before you go in the direction of making quilts for shows. There's also a lot of different categories. So depending on what your strengths might be or what your interests are, would be the category that you would be most likely going in that direction with. So those were a couple of very important points to start off with.
And now that you've won and have won a couple of times, have you found that that has triggered more ideas, or do you think it has dampened your ideas?
When it comes to quilt and quilting designs, I seem to have an ability to do that where I'm not really feeling like I'm running out of ideas. So I know a question was put to me after I returned back from QuiltCon. It's like, so what are you going to wow us with next? And I thought, well, maybe what I can do is something different and take people through the entire process of how I do make a show quilt. So for the first time, I started taking like pictures every day as I was doing my work and posted those pictures on Instagram every evening and took my followers through the entire process of making a quilt from start to finish. So that was a really awesome experience and a fun thing to do. I have been asked this question before. It's like, where do you find your inspiration for your designs for your quilt? And I really don't have to look any further than my own imagination to come up with these thoughts. But I will say this, I do believe just about everything in quilting has been done before. So when I'm looking at doing something, I'm just wanting to put my own spin on it. So for example, in 2019, one of the quilts that I made, I was working with half square triangles. And we've all made quilts with half square triangles, but I wanted to do something that was a little bit untraditional. So instead of sewing all of my half square triangles together, I actually appliqued them all down onto my quilt. And as I was doing this, I was developing a new technique, which I call hover quilting. And so that's just one example of how I will look at something that we're all familiar with and we all like doing, but just trying to come up with a different approach that perhaps has not been done before.
I find that myself when I'm designing STASHBUSTER patterns that, oh, here's a nice easy block. And then you go online and you find, you know, it's all been done before, but it's the way that you approach it. And it's the way
Absolutely.
the colors go into it, which makes it fresh and new.
Yes, absolutely. Like my quilt that won Best in Show at QuiltCon is called Starring You. And it's a large star in the middle of the quilt. And then there's a burst that comes out of that star. Well, I've seen that design before. Like, I'm not the first person to take a star and make it blow up on a quilt,
Yeah.
for sure. But when I was doing that, I was doing my own spin on how I thought I could make that quilt, take that design and make it original. And that's how I approach the design on all of my quilts.
My personal favorite is the cityscapes. I think you know that. You may know that. If there's a fan club for a quilt, I would be on yours for this one. I remember seeing it at Quilts at the Creek, and just like a fine piece of artwork, I could have stood there for probably an hour just looking at all the layers and all the techniques. I think I was there probably for 45 minutes.
Yes, I do remember that, Karen.
I still like it. Like I've done the workshop. I now have my pillow.
Nice.
But I still love it, like the techniques and how you blended them together. And I will definitely take some of the skills I learned in that workshop into my next quilts that I'm thinking of doing.
That's really awesome. I love hearing that.
You're doing your workshops a little bit differently. You're doing your workshops on Instagram. How is that working out?
Yeah, so, you know, everything in March really kind of collapsed on us and everything came to a grinding halt. And after I got back from QuiltCon, I actually had booked in like 38 trunk shows and workshops. And then in April, it kind of all stopped. So I really quickly redesigned my 2 workshops and started offering them on Instagram. And the feedback has been really, really awesome. So what I've done with my workshops on Instagram is I've broken them down to 3 vantage points. So I'm showing videos, pictures, and text where I'm working in front of my sewing machine, where I'm working at my ironing pressing board, I'm working at my cutting board, and I'm also talking to people through my videos as well. And I also include a workshop handbook. So I'm kind of covering all the different ways that people like to learn within my workshops themselves. Getting back to my cityscape quilt, when I was at Quilts at the Creek and you came over and you were looking at my quilts, I was I was really honored because I was asked if I could put 5 quilts in the show. And to me, it was such a big deal because I hadn't taken 5 quilts before and had the opportunity to exhibit them in a show side by side. So my cityscape quilt was the 5th quilt that I was making to go into that show. And I was really running out of time. So if people could have saw how fast I was quilting that quilt, their heads would have spun because I really, really needed to get it done on time. So when it was hanging in the show and people were having a look at it and talking about it, and my favorite part of that whole weekend was standing where my quilts were and having the opportunity to talk to other quilters about my quilts. So yeah, there was a lot of interest in that particular quilt, and that kind of spurred me on to write a workshop on that quilt and offer the techniques that I developed for that quilt.
And where did hover quilting come from? Was it just you just didn't feel like putting the HSTs together and that's another way? Or had you seen the raw edge applique and liked, or
Yeah,
did you just wake up one day and said, oh, hover quilting?
So where that came from was I made 2,500 2.5-inch Hasbro triangles. And after I had made this huge selection of all of these small little Hasbro triangles, the thought of sewing them all together was really unappealing. So I did a couple of small samples where I was gluing these pieces down and then sewing them down and throwing them through the wash and to see what kind of a frayed edge I could come up with. So I think on my 3rd attempt, I came up with the frayed edge that I was looking for. And when I put the quilt itself together, which was 1,440 2.5-inch Hasbro triangles, it turned out to be a very large quilt. It was 90 inches wide and 100 inches long, which I'll never make that size quilt again, too big. But when I put it through the wash and I was finished with it and I had it hanging up on my design wall, the pieces looked like they were floating on top of the black background. So to me, it was like they were sort of hovering in space. So that's where the name hover quilting came from. It was just the inspiration from seeing how the first quilt turned out.
I like that you say that it took you several times to come up, you experimented. That's one
Yes.
thing I'm constantly telling my viewers, that you need to play. You
Absolutely.
need to allow yourself to make these mistakes,
Yes.
and do it in the practice pieces
Yes.
and not
Yes.
in the big pieces. And, you know, you just discover things. You discover the way that you like to hold, and you, as you say, you discover your results as well.
Yes. When I'm making a quilt, quite often I will be making a little tiny quilt at the same time. So if I need to do some experimenting, I have that small quilt beside me where I can do some experimenting on that before I'm actually working on my real quilt. So for example, Star and You took me 4 months to make from start to finish. And before I started that quilt, I actually had practiced all of my quilting motifs for 2 months before I got on that quilt. So there was a lot of intention. There was a lot of practice, and I guess it worked out really well because it did win Best in Show. So it was worth the time investment, that for sure.
And not only Best in Show, it's been highlighted in curated quilts in their black and white edition.
Yes.
Did it hang at Quilt Canada?
So unfortunately, Quilt Canada was canceled this summer, and I had 5 quilts that were going to be hanging at Quilt Canada. So my 5 quilts are now going to be grandfathered into the next show in 2021, which is going to be here in Toronto.
Yeah.
And I'm actually part of the faculty next year. So I'm going to be teaching 2 workshops at Quilt Canada. And I'm actually going to be doing a trunk show there as well. But the really cool thing is they're actually going to be showing 250 quilts instead of 150. So there's an opportunity for 100 more quilts to go into that show. So all of my quilts that I'm making now in 2020, I'll be putting them through the application process. And I'm really hoping that I might get another 1 or 2 in the show.
let's just talk about the one that you've just finished. Or,
Sure.
sorry, what is the name? I just call it the orange peel, but you've done it. You've done two quilts, reflection of one another.
Yeah,
Not reflection, they're the inverse of the other.
yeah, kind of like a negative image of each other.
And I remember watching you on Instagram do these phenomenal squares and put them together, and then you cut it up.
I did. And, you know, I think I'm getting a little bit of a reputation for that because I'm really willing to like push past and go to the next step. And if that involves like cutting up all of my work and putting it back together again, I'm totally on board with that. So with these two quilts, I designed a new block, which is kind of a combination of a 9-patch and a log cabin put together. So I'm calling it a 9 cabin. So I made two quilts using cherry wood fabrics, which have a really beautiful depth of color. And I made one quilt top with all of the really light neutral tan colors, and the other quilt top with all of the darker purples and pinks and burgundies. And once I got those two quilt tops made, I layered them on top of each other and kind of like tacked them together in all of the corners so everything would be lined up very nicely. And then I made this really large oversized stencil of the orange peel design. And I drew the design on top of the two quilts. And then I just took a very large rotary cutter with a new blade and cut them all up. Yes, and then I started the process of putting them back together again. So I used the hover quilting technique again. So what I did with those large pieces was I appliqued them all down onto an oversized piece of white fabric. And once they are all appliqued down into place, then behind the quilt, I cut away all of the extra white fabric. So when you look closely at those quilts, you'll see around the orange peel design a little bit of a white halo, which just makes the design itself pop a little bit more. So the thought that I had for making those two quilts was I wanted to make the first quilt to sort of represent what our world looked like before COVID-19 showed up, and the second quilt to reflect the changes that we're now looking at in our world. So what I did to do that was my second quilt, because I am willing to do something different with my quilts, was I covered probably about 50% of it with really super sheer fabric. And I just quilted those right on top of my finished quilts and put it through the wash one more time to get that frayed edge happening, and came up with the concept and design of the first quilt being called Unshuttered and the second quilt being called Shuttered.
I can't wait to see the shuttered in person. If it shows up well on Instagram, it's just going to be breathtaking in person. So
Thank you.
I can't wait till lockdown disappears and you show it at Guild.
One of the really important parts of doing show quilts is taking the photographs, because when you're wanting to put quilts into a show, you're sending in photographs of your quilt, and depending on the quality of those photographs, it might make or break your chances on getting your quilts into the show. So to prepare and to take really good shots of my quilts, I bought myself some new lighting to enhance the pictures. And I also bought myself a new iPhone. So I'm working with the brand new technology of what Apple offers us with our phone. So with the combination of having proper lighting, having a good camera, and then having a design wall where you can actually hang your quilts and get that really nice, flat, bright picture that people are looking for when you're sending your quilts in for a juried show.
Do you think that there's some kind of bias within quilt shows towards particular designs, like vibrant quilts would possibly win more than monochromatic or low volume colors?
Yeah, I haven't really thought that myself. I think there's always some things that are on trend and that might have some influence on what's happening at a quilt show. For example, curated quilts put out a call looking for black and white quilts. And it was a conversation that I had with a woman at Quilts at the Creek that actually started to talk to me about curated quilts because I wasn't familiar with that magazine. And she saw my black and white quilt starring you and said, you really should be entering this in curated quilts. So of course I went online and looked for the application process, and I did that. And they have, in every one of their episodes, they have 20 quilts that they call in their gallery. And so they chose my black and white quilt to hang in their gallery. For me, this was the first time I was getting recognition for one of my quilts, sort of on a broader scale. And it was really super exciting. So I think black and white quilts this past year have been, I've seen so many of them online. They've been really, really well received. And that could have had a small amount of influence at QuiltCon. I'm not too sure, but yeah, that could have had some influence. When I'm making my quilts, I tend to make larger quilts because I like the visual impact. When somebody is walking into a room and looking around and looking for a quilt that might catch their eye, I kind of feel if I'm making a really large quilt, that might help somebody come on over and have a closer look at my quilt. But as far as going in one direction with, you know, color versus not a lot of color, I really haven't, I haven't really noticed that, Karen.
I was at Shipshawana and I saw this back. It was low volume, but very well quilted. And I'm taking a picture of it and I'm trying to find the label to go with it so I know who did it. And I'm looking and I'm looking and I'm looking. And finally I find a small tag down at the bottom and it says Best in Show. I'm going, what? And I realize I've been looking at it from the back.
Oh, wow.
There's a whole other side that I haven't seen, but I thought it was so spectacular, just even from the back. All these low volumes in the quilting.
So at QuiltCon, the top 4 quilts, when they hang them so you can actually see the front and the back. So there was Best in Show, and then there was Best Hand Quilting, Best Quilting on a Long Arm, and Best Machine Quilting Frameless. So those 4 quilts were at the very front when you walked into the exhibit hall. And it was really awesome that you could actually go to the backside of those quilts, because the backside really does help tell the story of what the quilting is on a quilt.
Well, I personally love being a white glove lady so that you can actually hold, like, show everybody the spectacular backs. There's as you say, there's a whole other story on the back.
Absolutely.
That is just as, sometimes maybe just as important, or tells the whole story of the quilt.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what's next? What you're a COVID champion. You're in your space in Toronto, but you've now got your Zoom workshop and lecture that's going out there in the world. How far out in the world are you?
So things are starting to pick up again as guilds are sort of accepting that things have changed a lot now. And virtual really is the way that I think it's going to be for quite some time. For example, York Heritage has decided for the entire year coming forward, everything there is going to be virtual. So I now have 16 virtual trunk shows booked in, so I'm pretty stoked about that. That's really awesome. And a couple of guilds have picked up on wanting to go forward with my Instagram workshops, so that's really cool. I'm offering both of my workshops once a month on an ongoing basis on Instagram. So if anybody's looking for my workshops, they are available once a month. And I'll be keeping that going, I think, for quite some time. So after I got back from QuiltCon, I had a lot of new opportunities come my way. And one of those was becoming a brand ambassador for Cherrywood Fabric. So this year, all of the quilts that I've been designing and working on have been based with using Cherrywood fabric. So that's been really, really awesome. Something that happened recently, I'm just going to scoot over here so you can see this beautiful machine beside me here.
And you're going to watch me turn green with envy.
So recently, I just became a brand ambassador for Bernina Canada. So they just came out with a brand new quilter, brand new quilting machine, which is a sit-down mid-arm, and it has a 16-inch throat. So I was like literally the first person in Canada to take one of these home. So I'm really stoked about my new relationship with Bernina Canada. So I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, I've got, I think, 5 different quilts ahead of me right now where they're all works in progress. So I usually have a few different designs ahead of me that I'm looking forward to. So I've got those that I'm looking forward to finishing. And beyond that, I'm not quite sure.
So can you tell us about the project that's behind you, or is that still top secret?
Sure, yeah. So the quilt top that is behind me, I painted an oil painting about 5 years ago, and I have been looking at that painting for years and years and years thinking, I really want to take that design and make a quilt top out of it. So I had a little bit of a slowdown because I was waiting for some products to come in from the States. I had a couple of rolls of batting on my way, so I couldn't make any quilt tops or move forward. So I looked at this painting on the wall and I decided it was time to make this quilt top. So that's the one that we're looking at there. It's called Parks and Recreation, and there's going to be some other stuff that is appliqued on top of this once I get those 3 layers put together. So it was a really fast quilt top to make. I think it took me maybe 2 or 3 days, and it was just one of those fill my time in projects.
Right. So do you just do light and fluffy quilts now, or are all of your quilts big statement pieces?
So, you know, every once in a while, a baby comes along and there needs to be a baby quilt made. So I did make one recently, and I used a couple of charm packs. So they're like 5-inch squares, and literally made this baby's quilt, I think, in one afternoon, which was so much fun because it was incredibly easy. And I had a really good feeling about the mom really appreciating getting this quilt. And when she did get it, she decided to hang it up on the wall behind her baby's change table instead of actually using it as a quilt. And she has said that when she's changing her baby girl, that the baby looks up at the colors and kind of reaches for them. So that was a real fun, quick, short project to do. After finishing Unshuttered and Shuttered, I did want to move on to something that was easier. So definitely sometimes I'm in the mood to do something that might be a little bit quicker and easier. Or I might have something that I'm just not showing anyone, and it could be a surprise in the future.
Oh. So are you doing the, are you going to be at the workshop with Krista Henberry?
Yes, I am. So that is a virtual workshop for the Toronto Modern Quilt Guild. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Just to see how an instructor is handling a virtual workshop, to learn from that. Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to it.
And do you still find that you like to take workshops, like skills workshops, or are you just too busy right at the moment to do that?
It's funny, you know, like sort of when quilting turns into a business, because there's so many different aspects of what I'm doing that don't involve making a quilt. So there's so much time put into all of these other things that you wouldn't even really think of. So for example, in April, when we were first into COVID, I decided to take my hover quilting workshop and offer it free online on Instagram and Facebook. And it was a real fun day of learning for me because I hadn't done that before. And at the end of the day, I had put out a hashtag saying, while you guys are working today, hashtag your pictures to I'm into hover quilting. So towards the end of the day, I looked up that hashtag and there were hundreds and hundreds of pictures. And I had no idea that the deep reach of Instagram is global. So I did a really quick 3-question survey. And one of the questions was, where in the world are you joining me from? So I wrote down the first 50 responses, and it really opened my eyes to how wide a workshop can go and how quickly this can happen for you. So about a week after I had finished that workshop, I was contacted by the Canadian Quilt magazine, Canadian Quilters magazine, and they said, we heard that you just pulled off this global workshop at the beginning of a pandemic. Can you write an article on it? So I'm like, I would love to. So that article just came out this month in the Canadian Quilters magazine. So that's just one example of something that comes up that you're really excited about and it's fun to do, but you don't have your hands on a quilt. You're doing something else.
So are there quilters right now that you're, let's say, looking towards, or you follow intently just because they're, well, one, they're inspiring, but two, you're learning from?
I am not following one quilter.
Everybody's following you. You're the quilter that everybody's following at the moment.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that, all of those years of like quilting by myself and not really wanting to have outside influences coming into my head and into my designs. So although there's this great big world on Instagram where there's, thousands and thousands of beautiful images all the time, I check my Instagram. If somebody is commenting, I always write back and respond to that comment, but I hardly ever scroll through Instagram and have a look at what's going on. So I use Instagram to share my quilting and to engage with my followers, but that's really about it.
So what do you see the end of your year being? Are you more teaching, or are you just getting into the groove of what 2021 will be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Right now, things are changing a lot for all of us quilters, and I'm just doing my best to stay ahead of the curve and not fall behind it. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that are going on. For example, Curated Quilts contacted me and said, we'd like to do an article on you, but we want you to write the article. I'm like, okay. So I just finished working with the editor, and we've finished the last step of that article. And I don't know what month that'll be going up on their blog, but that was a real fun thing to do as well. So I'm always working on a few things, and there's always something sort of coming down the tunnel, and there's always something looking forward to that might be happening within the next few days or within the next week. Like, for example, talking with you today, Karen. So
You're officially retired, right?
I am. So I retired in 2009, but you have to understand, once you're a hairstylist, you never 100% retire. So I do have some friends and family, and I still take care of their hair, but it's very, very minimal. And I work full-time on all of the different aspects of quilting. So yeah, I put a lot of time into what I'm doing.
So is it about time that you get an assistant or a virtual assistant? Are you at that level of?
Yeah.
Is that a distraction for you?
No, I'm really, really happy with, I don't mind spending time by myself. So I'm really, really happy working on my projects, and I don't feel I need an assistant, although every time I am writing something, I have a couple of friends that will look through the article and make sure all of the quilting words are being used properly, and make sure the spelling and the grammar is good. And so I definitely have helpers when I need them, but the majority of what I'm doing, I just really like doing it myself.
thank you, Peter, so much for showing up today. I really appreciate it. It's been fun talking to you. You're always, always very generous with your time and your advice. Just let's go over how people can contact you if they're interested in taking one of your online workshops. Do they email you, go to your Instagram, or do you have a website?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to get a hold of me is just to go on Instagram and do a search for Peter's Quilts, and you can direct message me there. You're welcome to email me, and my email address is petersquilts@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook, and I do have a website, peterbquilts.com.
Well, thank you so much for showing up today, Peter. It's been a joy. I hope you come back again another time. I hope your great success next year in with all your quilts at Quilt Canada.
Thank you.
And I cannot wait till we can get together again and I get to see updates on your quilts. So
yes, me too. I'm looking forward to the day when we can get back together at the Toronto Modern Quilt Guild and just start, being with each other and really enjoying show and share and see what everybody is up to. I think we're probably going to have like 3 meetings in a row where it's 100% show and share.
Yeah.
Because everybody is at home making so many quilts right now. It's really awesome.
Yeah. This month, all the people with A to B names, and this month will be.
Yes. And I am really looking forward to Quilt Canada at 2021. It is going to be my first year that I'm putting quilts into the show. So yeah, I'm totally looking forward to that. And thank you so much, Karen, for having me today. This was a lot of fun. And yeah, we should do this again sometime.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Peter Byrne. You can tell I had a lot of fun doing it. I'll put all of Peter's contact information in the notes below. Coming up next on the Quilt Circle will be Arina of Sugary Dew and Chris English from A Full English. So be sure to hit that subscribe button so you'll be notified when these interviews go live. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell beside the subscribe button so that YouTube will notify you when I make new videos. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Just Get It Done Quilts. And of course my website, where there's all sorts of free STASHBUSTER patterns at justgetitdonequilts.com. So take care, and I'll see you next time.